Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the Mythbusters session. I'm Tim. This is my colleague, Alan. We work at the Telecom data provider, TeleGeography, but today we're your Mythbusters. If we could get our, we're ready to go here. There we go. So what is myth busting, you might be asking? Well, I've got a slide prepared for you. I call it, what is myth busting? It's pretty simple. We take a look at common sayings we use in the submarine cable industry, or sometimes what people in the media say about our industry, and we try to test them. We try to test if it's a valid observation about what's really going on, or if it's a myth. So what we're going to do is try to apply actual data as objectively as possible and find out if that myth is confirmed, if it's merely plausible, or if it's busted. Now, it's hard to believe, but Alan, we first started this whole Mythbusters thing, the presentation format at Paris, SubOptic Paris in 2013. And I recall afterwards, we were pretty sure we would not be invited back. Yeah. But to our surprise and mild dismay at your judgment, we were. And in fact, this is our 5th time doing this. So inspired by that, we've came up with something we like to call the Mythbusters Guarantee. And it goes like this. As long as you will have us, we will be here. We will continue to do this bit until you suckers have had enough. For real. We will run this baby right into the ground. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to start our presentation in the way that so many other SubOptic presentations also start, with scripture reading. This one comes from Proverbs 26 and 11. It's one of my favorite verses, actually. As a dog returneth to his vomit, so a fool returneth to his folly. Listen, you are the ones who keep inviting us back, okay? If we are the folly, I'm afraid that makes you the... I'm sorry, I didn't write this. This is divinely inspired. Speaking, though, of regurgitation, that brings us to our theme today. The myths that we're going to test, it's a little bit different in format than, not really in format, but in content than what we've done in the past. We only have one new myth, but because this is our 5th one, we thought it would be fun to go back over the years, take a look back at some of the myths that we confirmed or busted, and see if they still hold up. A lot has changed in the industry in the last 12 years, and also we have access to new data sets that we didn't at that time. So here's a quick preview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start with an oldie but a goodie. You probably get this question a lot. Will new satellites end the dominance of submarine cables? Secondly, for the placement of large data centers, is energy a more important factor now than proximity to large population centers? And then I'm going to take a breather, and Alan's going to come up with 4 pretty fun myths as well. He's going to talk about, first, the demand for submarine capacity. Is it doubling every 2 years? Next, content providers account for the majority of investment in new cables. Is that a myth or is that true? Third, for Alan, the global network has never been more resilient. And finally, you're presenting a brand new, and it's hard to believe that we haven't touched on this, because I've been hearing about this one since I joined the industry in the mid-1990s. The submarine cable market is cyclical. We hear that one still a lot. And then Alan's going to take a seat. I'm going to conclude for us today with 2 myths that touch on geopolitics. 1, geopolitical conflict between China and the U.S. has caused the 2 countries' networks to disconnect. Is that true? Has that happened? And finally, we're going to conclude with a favorite. If you like fish, you may want to stick around for this one. We're going to examine whether sharks and sort of the new version of sharks, acts of sabotage, are a major source of submarine cable faults. Okay? So in a way, this is a repeat for us, a greatest hits, if you will. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any concert merch to actually sell. We're not selling this t-shirt, but we do have something free for you if you like. This QR code will take you to a page where you can download the slides afterwards if for some reason you're not sick of it by the time this is over. We're not comparing ourselves to the popularity of a rock band, but in a way, we've reached the artistic peak or trajectory of a rock band once, when they're completely creatively tapped out and they reach back cynically for their past and just trying to repeat some of that and cobble together a greatest hits album. Well, that's us today. Welcome to the show. All right, let's start. Satellites versus cables. Will new satellites end the dominance of submarine cables? So we first looked at this, we looked at this several times. Most recently, it was in New Orleans in 2019, and we concluded that it was busted. But that satellites do have an important role to play in complementing submarine cables. But a lot really has changed in just the last 6 years. This is a really interesting graphic that grabbed my attention from Starlink's most recent annual report. And it goes to the end of 2024, maybe the very beginning. And it's showing how much capacity they put into space on their satellites. Look at that line climbing up. And Elon Musk does own a majority of Starlink. And he says a lot of outrageous things. And he does kind of have let's be honest, sort of a huckster attitude that many of us kind of tune out. But in this case, for sure, the gains have been really impressive. Not only have they made these gains through sheer volume, they've put up over 8,600 satellites in space. They've done it through some pretty impressive technological gains on each satellite. They improved on their version 1 satellite with a V1.5 that came out in 2021. That allowed them for 24 gigabits per second of total capacity. Then a couple years later, they came out with their V2 satellite that individually has 96 gigabits total capacity. And finally, they have finalized design for their V3 satellite, which they think will offer a total of a terabit per second capacity per satellite. Now, they had been planning on launching that in 2025. My understanding is that they were waiting on the Starship launch vehicle to launch it, and that's having some technical difficulties. So the V3 satellites are not up, but they've achieved these gains just through a mix of V1, 1.5, and 2. So I was really curious about what that number really means, because have you seen annual reports where there's just sort of a number going up, they never explain their methodology? It kind of drives me crazy. So I found a really cool site that tracks every single launch and how many satellites went up in every launch, and was able to reverse engineer this chart. And it turns out what they're actually showing is their total launch, not net operational satellites, the total launched. But even so, it's really impressive. And it's gone well beyond what their annual report was showing. That showed 350 terabits per second at the end of 2024. Now we are at around 500 terabits per second from the Starlink constellation. It's impressive. However, some launches have failed, but more importantly, for a LEO satellite system, after a while they fall out of orbit. They've deorbited. So this chart shows how much is actually still in orbit. Still very impressive. But here's a critical observation. I realized that they were actually showing downlink capacity. But the system is designed completely asymmetrically, almost to 10 to 1 downlink to uplink. So if you want to look at their uplink capacity, that's what we're looking at here. So keep this one in mind. We're going to come back to it in a minute. What I want to look at is cost per bit analysis of satellites, because our question is, will cables or satellites supplant cables? And by the way, there are a lot of other LEO systems out there. I'm just looking at Starlink because it's the one that has the most mature business plan. Okay. First of all, we have to acknowledge this is a little bit silly because it's an apples to oranges comparison. Cables are strictly point-to-point, and satellite systems, especially like Starlink, are analogous to an end-user network. They're multi-point to multi-point, really. That's how they're optimized. However, let's put that aside for a moment. I want to acknowledge in the setup of our methodology a few problems for Starlink. One, they're extremely constrained for actually point-to-point capacity. they use spectrum, and they are constrained on spectrum. My understanding is they're only allowed to point a single beam at a point. So even once they get a V3 satellite up, if I'm understanding this correctly, you're talking about a max of 1 terabit per second at a point to another point. So that's a fraction of one fiber pair, which is a fraction of a cable, which is a fraction of our industry. So from the very beginning, this is a little bit problematic. Also on OpEx, how much annual OpEx do you have to operate a cable? It's probably in the low millions, I would say. That's a pretty good estimate. OpEx on Starlink estimated last year over $2 billion. And finally, here's the really big problem. Cables designed for 25 years can go well beyond. Once a satellite's put up in orbit, it's basically immediately falling down. You know, there's gravity that you have to fight with. They are made to last 5 years, after which they're deorbited, or their orbit would decay anyway. However, what we're going to do is ignore these problems. The individual you see there jumping for joy is Elon Musk. I believe he was literally jumping for joy at a rally of his favorite presidential candidate last year. But let's pretend he's just happy that he doesn't have to deal with these problems. And I want to acknowledge, we're really comparing apples to oranges. This is a silly sort of thing to do. It's kind of a fool's errand, but this is Mythbusters. We kind of want to be a little bit foolish. So let's start with the comparison. A fully laden submarine cable, state-of-the-art, I'm estimating with construction costs, and you light up every single fiber, let's say it's 24 fiber pairs, around $500 million. That's a single cable. Starlink constellation, a conservative estimate for a 5-year spin for them is $15 billion. Elon Musk a few years ago said he thought it would end up being $20 to $30 billion, and for once, I didn't think he was exaggerating. But we're going to be conservative with our estimates in a number of ways for Starlink, because we're in the submarine cable industry. I don't want to be accused of bias. Okay, how much bandwidth can they contain? The submarine cable, 480 terabits per second. Right now, fully operational. Downlink for Starlink is 455, so that's pretty close. However, we want to look at symmetric bandwidth. You know, a cable, after all, we talk about fiber pairs. It's fully symmetric. But Starlink constellation is constrained by how much they can get up, not just down. So we're looking at their uplink capacity. That's 50 terabits per second. Next, there's a concept called the efficiency ratio. There are a number of things that constrain what is maximally possible on a LEO satellite constellation. Here's just one example. The Earth is 2/3 water, and hardly anyone lives over the water. They live on land. So that takes down how much capacity the constellation can be used at any one point by 66% already. Quilty Research, who I really recommend as an expert in the satellite space, estimates that the Starlink constellation, at any one point in time, their efficiency ratio is between 5 and 10%. So again, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to Starlink and put them at 10%. But 50 times 10% is 5. So now we're at 480 versus 5. What's that work out to? A lifetime cost per megabit? About $1 for the submarine cable, $1 per meg, and around $3,000 for Starlink. So that's a 2,800 to 1 ratio. So on a cost per bit ratio, they're still, even after the fantastic gains of satellites, they're still nowhere near cables. Okay, but let's pretend for a moment that money is no object, and we can also smash as many beams as we can. Let's say we go fully to free space optics, which I think is unregulated bandwidth, and it's possible to do all of that. So how many satellite systems would we need to get up to the cables? Okay, so this is the chart I just showed a few moments ago. This is the exact same chart, but it's on a different scale because I need to make room for cables. And that's what we see here. This is TeleGeography's estimate of how much cable capacity has been purchased over the past few years. So again, a reminder, to get them equal, we need to get this red line up to the green. And not only that, we know there's going to be a lot of growth in the cable industry or the international bandwidth industry in the next few years. If you want to get some more details on this, make sure you come to this room tomorrow afternoon where Alan is presenting with Mike Constable on some of our forecasts for cable kilometers and what that means for marine maintenance. But it doesn't appear possible to me that satellites is anywhere near capable of taking over the role of cables. So this one, I think we can pretty much definitively rule as busted. But what of Starlink as an access replacement for mobile phones or fixed broadband? Well, if you can see the red there, that's how many subscribers they have now. Now, it's extremely useful in certain places where it's difficult to get cable or fiber optic capacity. There are a lot of other applications that satellites render that fiber optic cable simply can never catch up to. And in certain backup situations, redundancy, satellites can play a really critical role for users of submarine cables that have more limited capacity needs. But will they end the dominance of submarine cables? There's no way, come on, that is ridiculous. So this one is busted. All right, our next one is going to go a little faster, but it's fun talking about satellites and cables. This one, for the placement of large data centers, energy is now a more important factor than proximity to population. We talked about this in 2016, I believe. Was it 2016? Yes, Dubai. And we ruled this one plausible. That's because we didn't have a lot of data at our disposal at that moment. I'm going to show you a few anecdotal things, first of all. This is a map of all data centers that we know of. This is about 5,000. Each dot is an individual data center. Now, let's talk about where the large data centers are. Some of the largest are, in terms of power and space, are run by Meta and Google. Let's take a look at where they are. Some of them adhere to kind of where the blue dots are, which roughly match where the human population is. However, if you look, there's some curious placement choices. Northern Sweden, Finland, even in the United States, there's a lot in the central part of the United States where the population is not very high. So already you can sort of see that there's some curious choices here if these large data centers are trying to find where the population is. Well, it turns out we have developed some new data at TeleGeography. This is something we call the market connectivity score. And if you're nerdy about geography like us, or you want to know about telecom investment, good places, locations for investment, this might be of interest to you. I'm happy to describe it afterwards. But basically, it's a matrix of 3,000 different cities, and for each city, columns of data for 36 different data. Some telecom, some demographic, some about energy. What we're going to do today, though, is we're going to pull two pieces of data that will help us measure this myth. One is city population. For every data center, we're going to look at the population in a 100-kilometer radius around that data center. And for energy, we're going to choose the indicator that is in a radius around that data center, how much power is generated that is clean energy, which is another factor of importance for the largest data center operators. Okay, here's kind of our control group. This is the typical third-party colo operator that's been in business for 30 years or more. And you can see here's their average population for all their data centers. Here's the average, weighted average population in a 100-kilometer radius around those. Here's cloud operators, which is sort of in between the really large providers, because they do have to care about humans. They care more about the businesses that are serving the humans. Population, on average, is a little bit lower. Now, here are some of the largest content data center operators, the content providers, and you can see there's a marked difference here in the population. Also, a little bit in the clean power that's generated in those cities, not necessarily available to the data centers, but in general around them. But this is anecdotal. This doesn't prove anything. So let's go to a scatter plot of all data centers that are above a certain threshold. I think it's 500,000 square feet. Okay, if the data centers were following human population, you would kind of think that the largest data centers would be in the most populated areas, right? So there would be a positive correlation there. But look what we're seeing here. For the independent variable here is population, but the dependent is the square footage of the data centers, individual data centers. Each dot is a data center. And there's a negative correlation there. What about green energy or clean energy? Well, here's a positive correlation. It's a little less dramatic. But you can see the cleaner in the proximity to the cleaner of energy in the proximity to a data center, the larger the data center. Here at the bottom, the data is a little bit confused, but there's almost a suggestion of a linear relationship for the very largest data centers. So, for this myth, the placement of large data centers, energy is now more important than proximity to population. I think we have enough data now to say there's a negative correlation between data center size and population, positive correlation, data center size, and clean power availability. So we're going to say this one is actually, we're going to move this from plausible to confirmed. I'm going to have a sip of water. Alan's going to present some great myths.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Tim. So I'm going to do 4 in a row here and power through straight in a row here. So the first one I wanted to touch on is a pretty common one. We've done this one twice before, actually, which is the demand for submarine cable capacity is doubling every 2 years. We did this in our original one. We did it in the one after it. So 2 in a row, I thought, this probably hasn't changed, right? Well, let's consider, has it changed? It's been a while. It's been 9 years since we did it last. Quick math lesson for everybody. What does doubling every 2 years mean in terms of an annual growth rate? 41%, right? That's the red line we have here. That's the threshold for doubling every 2 years. So the chart I have here, I've laid out some major submarine cable routes, transatlantic, transpacific. Hope you can see them all up here. Intra-Asia, Europe, Asia, Africa, Europe to Middle East, with 3 different 5-year periods of the compound annual growth rate for us to look at this and see what's been happening. So the first period, we're above that doubling every 2 years threshold. For all these routes, the Atlantic was just a bit below, but then the next 5-year period here, 2015 to 2019, we can see it's still above, getting a little low there in the Pacific, Europe to Middle East, but it's still growing at a pretty rapid clip in all of these areas. Now, what's changed from 2020 to 2024? We have this. It's gone below the line. Everybody kind of awed, like, ooh, it's not that bad, okay? It's not that bad. Remember, this is doubling every 2 years, that threshold, but 26% per year, or these all bars are above 26%, that's doubling every 3 years. So it's not that bad, okay? So, but it is below the doubling every 2 years threshold, according to our data. But I wanted to go a bit beyond just our data and look at other sources to see what else is happening in different parts of the industry. So first, I found this chart from Ericsson showing mobile network data growth. This is from, I think, about 2020 to 2024, and it's hard to see, I know, but here's their line for the doubling every 2 years threshold. So you can see about 2021, that black line there, it dipped below the 41% threshold. So, but mobile traffic, as we all know, that is not an exact proxy for subsea cable capacity, but still a useful thing to bear in mind of what's happening on the access networks. Let's also look at what's happening in broadband networks, okay? So here's data that I found from a company called OpenVault, and they're showing here the year-on-year growth for the average broadband usage. And interestingly, you can see here this big spike in Q1 of 2020. What happened then? That's the COVID spike, okay? Everybody's working at home, broadband traffic soared, it was way up. Then, subsequently, it's gone way down. In the most recent period, I think it's 9.5% annual growth in the last period. What else do we have? Let's look at maybe some company-specific data here. So I found that AT&T themselves, they cited a figure of 30% annual growth from 2020 to 2023. They don't state what part of the network the growth is on, but it's interesting to see that they've cited that figure. They are not themselves equal to subsea capacity, but still, one more metric that shows slowing growth. Cogent, the big internet backbone operator, in their earnings call just last month, they indicated that their network traffic was flat sequentially for the quarter, but it increased only 8% year over year. So another metric here showing that the growth has been slowing. Let's go beyond carriers. Let's look at CDNs, the content delivery networks, and see what we have there. So late last year, Akamai released their earnings report, and in it, they had this pretty interesting statement. In terms of traffic growth, it is growing very slowly at rates we haven't seen in the 25-plus years we've been in this business. So it's growing very, very slow. Now, they don't define what very, very slow is, but we can assume it's probably less than doubling every 2 years, I would think, right? But again, even though they are a user of subsea capacity, they themselves aren't an exact proxy for submarine cable capacity demand growth, but still, one more example of slowing growth. Let's go to a more, maybe a useful company metric for this industry especially. Have you heard of Meta? So Meta released this in a presentation at their At Scale conference last fall, talking about the impact of AI on their network, and a pretty interesting chart. They gave a number here saying total backbone grew 30 or more than 30% year on year, which is below that 41% threshold. Not subsea specific. We don't know what the greater than symbol means here, but I would hope if it was more than 40%, they would have just said more than 40%. So let's assume it's 30 to 40% for Meta on their backbone, but again, we don't know what part of the network that was referring to exactly. One more company that you guys might have heard of. You heard of Google? So in April, they released this bit about their WAN bandwidth. Now, I'm not sure what portion of their overall capacity is accounted for in their assessment of what their WAN bandwidth is, but they did state over the last 5 years, there's been a 7-fold increase. If you convert that into a compound annual growth rate, that is about 48%. That's above the doubling every 2 years threshold, so that's kind of interesting. But again, it's not subsea specific. It could heavily be within the US or with Europe. It's within Europe. It's not very clear. So with all these examples in mind of how capacity has been slowing, let's look at why it's been slowing, actually, okay? So the reasons that we've heard from many operators and networks around the world are a few things. And the chief one is there's been a continued effort to localize content, applications, and compute. I pulled this additional slide from Meta's talk last fall from the At Scale conference. That was really interesting because they had this term they call bending the demand curve, which I think is a great way to think about this. Is they've been engaging in efforts to improve the placement of content and to optimize their network so that it's more efficient. So this chart here you can see on the right, the orange is what it would have been without engaging in these efficiency measures, and the blue is how they've been able to bend that curve down to make it more efficient. So demand is not slowing, it's still growing. It's not growing as fast as it would have been, so don't freak out, demand is still growing. One other issue we hear about also is the impact of submarine cable delays. So many operators have told us, yeah, they would have grown more if only they had had the cables that they have paid for in service to deploy what they want to deploy. So we could see some more rapid growth for some years when new higher capacity cables come into service, hopefully in the next couple of years. And finally, one factor that really impacts cloud providers or companies who are new to the market, often when they enter a market, they're adding 3, 4 paths of 400, 800, 1.6 terabits each to be able to meet the uncertain demand they're going to have in that market. So you get this huge surge. But then once they have that in place, the growth rates tend to slow on an annual basis. So you see a bit of a deceleration. And so that happens a lot in developing markets where these companies have been expanding their cloud regions into. So let's conclude this myth. The myth of the demand for submarine cable capacity is doubling every 2 years. From what we've shown, I think it's clear that the demand appears to have slowed, and it's less than 41% annually now. So this was confirmed the last 2 times we did it, but we're going to change it. This myth is now busted. It is not doubling every 2 years anymore. Okay, next one. Content providers account for the majority of investment in new cables. This seems like a pretty obvious one, right? But we did this one originally in New Orleans as well. At that point in time, they were not the majority in terms of the investors in new submarine cables, but we felt that if we counted in SLTE purchases, other capacity purchases, that they probably were the largest, but we just called it plausible. It wasn't quite clear yet. So let's take a new look at this. So just broadly, this is just based upon publicly disclosed planned cables, 2025, 28. Here's what we have on our map, cables that are either private content provider builds or ones in which at least one of those companies is involved in a consortium or a joint build. It's a lot of cables. There's also several cables that don't have their involvement, right? At least not publicly. So we're going to compare these two things to see what we're looking at in terms of the investment. So this chart is showing several of the major routes, the content provider's share of the investment. In the Atlantic, it's 100%. It's all Google and Meta right now. Trans-Pacific, Oceania, you can see those two are very high as well, 70+%. But when we look at overall, all the regions combined, we think at least it's just 52%. Well, that's a majority. So I guess the myth is busted now, finally, right? So we can say that for this one, they are certainly the majority. Even though it seems like it's a very small majority of the 52%, it's probably a lot larger when you take into account SLTE capacity purchases, fiber pair purchases on cables that they're not a direct member of the consortium or the build initially. So that one is confirmed. All right. This is a bit of an unusual one. We tried to test whether the global network has never been more resilient. So to do this one, we originally were trying to compare the number of cable paths that existed in 2016 between different major hubs to a 1926 telegraph map. It's pretty absurd, but at that point in time, we thought it was plausible we had more routes between major continents and locations than we did back then. So that's the old methodology. Here's the map we used. This is a beautiful 1926 telegraph cable map you can see. We compared it to our 2016 map. But this is going to be like the remix version of the song, a new version. So we're going to have a new methodology for this myth, for this version of Mythbusters. So we're going to use our first cable map. This was our first map we did in 1996. And you can see these little kind of rectangles here at the equator. Those are satellites. Oh, yeah. So those are the fiber optic cables that were existing and planned at that point in time. So let's look at the number of paths that we've been seeing on major routes first between 1996 and 2025 to see what we're seeing. So we can see here the y-axis here is the number of cables on these different interregional routes. So it's been going up for all these routes pretty much, right? So we are seeing more path diversity, more resiliency in that way. The one interesting exception here is the Atlantic. You can see in 2001, there's this huge peak. Then it's the highest. We haven't come back to that level yet. Cables have been retired. It went down. We're just now getting back up to that level where we were at previously. Well, in some of the minor routes, this is where we're seeing a lot more growth, a lot more interesting things happening, where we're seeing new cables between Asia and Oceania, Africa to South America. And also the bottom line there, this yellow line is straight. There's been no cables ever between Oceania and South America and Africa and Oceania. We're going to get one on each of those in the coming years, so we're seeing a big improvement in the interregional route diversity. Now, resiliency is not just a matter of how many cables do you have across an ocean. The capacity plays a very important role too. So let's look at that. And you see a very different picture here. So this chart is showing the number of cables in the Atlantic, and you can see those 18 cable paths. And I've grouped them by their maximum capacity, which are those colors there. So the bottom 10 cables there, over half the cables, those have less than 40 terabits. So you might think these 18 paths, wow, that's a lot of cables. Well, a lot of them are very, very, very low. If we weight it in terms of the maximum bandwidth, that's probably a better picture of what we're looking at here. So those 10 cables have 10% of the maximum capacity. And that big dark blue section there, there's just 4 cables in that, Those account for the majority of maximum capacity in the Atlantic, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. So when we think about, is the global network more resilient than it's ever been? We definitely have more cables than we've ever had on many routes, but I think we need to be cautious because resiliency is an issue of having capacity per path matched as well. So let's not call it confirmed yet. Let's wait. We're going to call this one plausible. Okay, last one. This is a time for the new one, where the audience is going to groan like, it's all been the greatest hits, songs you all know and love, and now it's like, this is a new one. Okay, but this is a myth I think we all know. We've repeated it many times. We've heard it in conversations. The submarine cable market is cyclical. Why do we think that? What's the origin of this myth? Well, here's the investment in new submarine cables based upon the years that cable entered service. Not when the cable was contracted, but when it entered service. So it's been a kind of unique ride, kind of up, kind of down. You could say it's kind of like a roller coaster, maybe. And I've obtained actual footage of a sub-cable industry veteran who's experienced this roller coaster ride up and down. I mean, she had fun. I'm not sure if you all had fun doing this, but it's been quite a ride the last couple of decades in the submarine cable industry. So thinking about what makes a market cyclical in terms of classical economic theory, and so what I found trying to investigate this was these are industries that are heavily influenced by broader economic conditions, automobiles, home construction, things like this. Also, the product or service is a discretionary, not necessary item, luxury goods, tourism. Also, if it's a classically cyclical market, the patterns have an irregular frequency and duration. They're not seasonal in nature. So for this first set of things, I think that requires us to do some investigation to try to bust this myth. Second one, we're good, because what I showed you before, that is not seasonal. That is all over the place. It's not predictable at all. I spent probably too much time trying to do this, trying to find what could I use as an economic indicator that would correlate to new cable investment. I couldn't really find anything. What I've put here in a chart is changes in global GDP growth to kind of see when we've seen global expansions and recessions globally and what's been happening in the background to cables. I couldn't find anything. If you want to spend some of your time and hours trying to find various things you can correlate to this, please try it. So with that in mind, I thought, I think there's probably a different way to look at this. It's not cyclical in a classic economic sense, but maybe there's a cycle that is a boom-bust cycle that is tied to supply and demand dynamics. So what I mean by that is, does an oversupply or undersupply of bandwidth lead to these up and down cycles? Because that's what I hear people say sometimes as well, like, oh, we're going to have an oversupply and we're going to stop building, right? So to test that, is that true? I looked at our data on the number of new cables when they've been built and the share of capacity that's been lit on two major routes, the Atlantic here on the left, Pacific on the right. The blue bars show the number of new cables, and then the green is showing the share that's lit. I don't see a pattern here. I don't see that cables are being built because we're running out of capacity. I also don't see cables not being built because the utilization rate has become so low. So if that doesn't drive what's happening with new builds, what does? Well, it's a lot of different factors. Clearly, it's can you acquire fiber repairs that you need for your network on existing cables? Maybe you need to build. Are there advantages for cost or the control of the network, the design of the network by building it yourself? There's competitive elements, there's strategic elements that go into this as well. Route diversity drives many new builds these days as well. So it's not just a question of an oversupply, undersupply cycle. So if it's not that, what's going on here? So to look at that question, I made a different chart. A lot of charts here, right? So I think what we're seeing is annual investment. It's just lumpy in nature. It's not cyclical, right? Cable projects have long variable lead times. There's often delays in cable. So you can't really infer too much about any single year that you're seeing because it's not a true indicator of the market being strong or weak, I think. So to try to prove this out, I created this chart that shows the trailing 5-year average of investment in new submarine cables over the last 15 years. And that turquoise line there kind of smooths out these wild annual fluctuations. So you can see that 1.5 to 2 billion a year has been the range, at least in the most recent period. So a lot less of that up and down as you might think. So I think the key here is we have to move past the telecom crash. I think that's what drives a lot of this sentiment that the market is cyclical is what happened 20 plus years ago now. What's changed is there's a direct correlation now between who's building the cables and who are the largest users of the bandwidth on the cables, right? So that definitely helps to mitigate some of the risk of there being an oversupply, undersupply scenario. One other positive thing that's happened is bandwidth growth has moderated. I've heard it's not doubling every 2 years. Maybe that's true. So when the pace of growth has slowed, there's less need to speculatively build when you're kind of faced with unsure demand requirements in the future growing at a really rapid clip. And last, I think the early 2000s were a bit of an oddity, it seems right now. And so it kind of skews the data that we've seen. It's kind of scarred the industry's consciousness about how we feel about what could happen in the future. And I don't see us having to repeat that scenario ever again. I mean, could we deploy four systems, which were 8 different cable spans across the Atlantic in 1 year? That seems just not likely to me at all to happen ever again. But do I want to tempt fate and say we're totally going to be fine, it's sunshine and rainbows forever? Let's talk about some reasons for caution too, so let's not get too excited. So subsea demand, as Tim was mentioning also, is very data center focused. Here's some of the data center locations for some of the major cloud providers, and Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, Google, and you can see their footprint there. The impact of power being available in these locations is going to shape where we can build cables and how many we're going to build. And so we could see some shifts around that in the future due to the availability of power. And tied to that, I think, is AI. There's a lot of uncertainty still about just how much is AI going to impact long-haul networks. How distributed is AI model training going to be or inference going to be? And that's going to have some direct role in the demand growth and the requirements for new submarine cables. And finally, one other risk here is there's a lot of these risks that are geopolitical, regulatory nature, permitting challenges, China-US issues, data residency, sovereignty issues, export controls for GPUs. These all can slow the pace at which cables get built. They can prevent cables from being built to certain places. Those are all real risks that we should acknowledge that could slow the investment in new cables in the future. Finally, Tim has taught me many things in life. The value of a good mustache is one. He also taught me about oligopsony. This is a pretty fancy word that he taught me. It's a small number of buyers controls a large share of the market. That's a pretty interesting thing in this market because that's what we have right now. We have hyperscalers, content providers, whatever you want to call them, who control a large share of the market in the Atlantic, as we showed earlier, 100% of cables. Globally, if you look at private cables by these companies, cables in which one of them is a member, it's about 2/3 of the investment in the far right column you can see there. So why is that a risk of some kind? Well, if there's any changes to their investment strategy, or if they change their topology of their network, that could have some impacts overall in the demand for certain routes and the bandwidth growth for that. So with all these words of caution in mind, I'm going to tempt fate. Is the market cyclical? I'm going to say the market does fluctuate on an annual basis, but I think a boom and bust cycle is not going to be a near-term risk. So I would knock on wood. There's no wood here, it's just plastic, but good luck to everybody. We're going to call this one busted. All right.
Words to live by. Good luck to everybody. So, just 2 tracks left in our so-called greatest hits album. Both of these touch on geopolitics, sensitive subject. And you might be thinking, you might be thinking, why would I even want to go there? Why even have the possibility of courting any controversy? But I wanted to reassure you, I'm uniquely qualified to talk about a subject that requires intimate knowledge of foreign and appreciation for foreign culture and the nuances and subtleties of diplomacy. I'm American. I find your laughter hurtful. So, I thought that you might be harboring some doubts about this. So what I've done is I asked Google's chatbot, Gemini, to help me prepare a written patriotic statement that will help convince you of my qualifications and credentials as an American to discuss the nuances of geopolitics. America's great presidents have consistently championed international harmony and open trade. Understanding that true peace hinges on shared interests and mutual respect, not just the absence of war. Through their patient diplomacy, their deep and abiding respect for global institutions, and their commitment to free trade, they've guided the world toward cooperation over conflict. The legacy of these great patriots underscores America's frequent role on the global stage in building bridges, not walls. I'm confused by your applause. What exactly were you applauding for there? So I guess this brings up the point that all of us do bring some prior judgments and prejudices even when we're talking about politics. What we're going to try to do for these last two myths, it's sensitive subjects, but we're going to try to stick to the data. Our next to last myth is China-US networks has the decoupling of cables, of physical direct connectivity between these two, cause an overall network disconnection. Now, we only talked about this just 2 years ago in Bangkok, just 2 years, so it's fresh. I wasn't planning on revisiting this one. It's a new one. But something happened a month and a half ago that really grabbed my attention, and I felt compelled to talk about it again. And it was a United States Senate Judiciary Committee hearing called A Time for Truth, Oversight of Meta's Foreign Relations and Representations to the United States Congress. And it featured a whistleblower from Meta, this person here. Now, the vast majority of her testimony I'm not going to cover. A lot of it was on Facebook's content moderation and promotion policy and some other things dealing with China I'm not at all expert in. But there was one statement that she made that really grabbed my attention that I wanted to address. Talking about Facebook in China, she said there was no bridge too far. Meta built a physical pipeline connecting the United States and China. The executives ignored warnings that this would provide backdoor access to the Chinese Communist Party, allowing them to intercept the personal data and private messages of American citizens. Apparently, from her book, what she was talking about was something called PLCN. Do you guys remember this cable? Both Google and Meta invested hundreds of millions of dollars in it, literally sunk under the sea, and then Team Telecom nixed the plan. They Team Telecom also required the cancellation of several other cables that would have directly connected China and the United States. Now, there's only one old legacy system, to the best of my knowledge, that still directly connects the two countries. So what we want to talk about is not whether that was good policy or bad policy. That's not what I'm here for. I simply want to talk about the myth of if you disconnect physical pipelines or cables between countries, does that disconnect their network? Here is the good old OSI network stack. How many of you hate this and are still confused by it? I certainly am. 30 years in the industry, so I don't really blame policymakers for being confused. But really, when we're talking about disconnecting cables, we're talking about layer one, physical. That's not where the traffic is. The payloads that they want to talk about, the secret stuff of Americans that the Chinese Communist Party apparently wants, according to the testimony, are on entirely different layers. Now, that is kind of technical. So what I'm going to attempt is a really rough metaphor. The engineers here, please don't be mad at me for messing this up. But what I want to look at is Google Maps view of the neighborhood that's not far from where I live. I live about an hour and a half drive northwest of Washington, D.C. The green is land, the blue is a river, is the Potomac. The little town north of the Potomac is Brunswick, Maryland, and the little town just below is Lovettsville. Now, what if it were your task to deliver a packet or a parcel from Brunswick to Lovettsville? Now, what if furthermore, I keep running into this. I'm going to stand over here. Do you mind if I lurk behind you?
It's fine.
What would you do if the bridge went out? Let's say Lovettsville passed a law that they don't want any more bridges directly connecting Brunswick and Lovettsville. Would you give up and go home? No. If you knew alternate routes, you would probably take them. Or, more likely, you would pull out your phone in your car and use the map app to determine an alternate path around. The bridge is not the only way through. Bridges and roads in this very rough metaphor or physical layer, map apps are an IP routing table. They're really good at finding point-to-point segments and then stringing those segments along and finding the optimum path between 2 points. IP is made for that, so if things break, things can be rerouted. Now, I also want to talk about autonomous systems and BGP. So let's say you're not going to be driving yourself. You want to hand this off to someone else. Well, the way it generally works on the internet is companies are assigned addresses where they deliver to. They're responsible for those addresses, IP addresses. In our scenario, let's say DHL is up in Brunswick and UPS is in Lovettsville. The way DHL would communicate with or figure out a way to deliver that parcel is it would look it up in a table and say, oh, that IP address belongs to UPS. Let me go to a neutral meeting place and have them finalize that delivery. They don't even have to directly connect or peer with between each other. They can go through third parties or third, fourth, fifth parties. Why am I talking about BGP? Well, that's the first way we're going to test this myth. We're going to look at direct BGP connectivity between US ISPs and Chinese ISPs. This is how many direct connections there were over time before Team Telecom really started stepping in with disconnecting the physical pipeline. Now, if traffic has gone down since then, or network has gone down, you would expect these lines to go down. That has not happened. It's continued to go up. There are far more BGP directed adjacencies or peering between US ISPs and Chinese ISPs. Now, you could tell me, okay, BGP has nothing to do with geography, and you would absolutely be right. That peering could be happening in third countries, Japan or Singapore, for instance. However, let's look where these ISPs are actually located. Here are Chinese networks in Washington, D.C. area data centers. These are not all of them. I just picked some of the ones that we all know. Now, this is not some sort of nefarious Chinese plot to infiltrate the United States. U.S. networks do the same thing. Here are U.S. networks in Hong Kong data centers. An awful lot that we recognize there. And they're not being unpatriotic. They're trying to provide good service for their end users. Now, I handpicked these. This is anecdotal evidence. This is not definitive. So what's happened quantitatively over time? How about US ASNs in China? Has that gone down? How about Chinese ASNs in the United States? Has that gone down? Nope. It's only going up. Not only has it gone up, but the number of cities and the dispersion of the cities has increased. Here is a map of Chinese AS presence worldwide. Take a look at the United States. 2019, here's 2025. So they're reaching out even further into the US to support their customers. And finally, this is something TeleGeography tracks, how layer 2 Ethernet and IP layer connectivity directly between two countries. In this case, it's China and the US. You're probably not surprised to find that this too has gone up over time. Okay, so this myth, that the physical decoupling of the networks has caused the two countries' networks to disconnect, that's not the way this works. That's not the way any of this works. The connectivity remains robust. So this one is busted. We're going to conclude with an old favorite, sharks. And this is not an intentional pun, but the media feeding frenzy lately, sharks have been replaced with acts of sabotage. You surely have noticed a lot of coverage lately about our industry that mention sabotage. So let's look at the original case. We did this several years ago, and I'm simply going to restate some of our original logic for this. We looked, could you get me a water?
Yeah.
We looked at news articles that mentioned sharks and submarine cables. This was back in 2016. It started with this Wired article, as best I could tell. Sharks wage war on undersea internet cables. Pretty dramatic. This one had an attribution. The global internet is being attacked by sharks, Google confirms. This one cast Google as the hero. Sharks eat the internet, but Google fights back. And even relatively staid media outlets got in on the action. The internet is broken, according to The Guardian. You can blame sharks and Netflix. This next outlet, I believe, went out of business, but this pretty much tells you all you need to know about their journalistic credentials. And finally, this was my absolute favorite. It simply says, why are sharks eating the internet? And it's a cold clinical question by these guys. It's from Fishing Tackle Retailer, all right? Okay. So we wanted to quantify this in some way. So what we did was looked at the number of Google searches you could find with various, iterating through various search parameters. Here's sharks eating fish, 1 million results. Sharks eating seals, 400,000 results. Sharks eating the internet, 1.3 million results. So I think what we can conclude from this data, what sharks eat, is it's pretty much that. Now, you've seen variants of this chart for many years. I think all of us in this room know that human beings are the number one cause for cable faults, not sharks. Fishing and anchoring. So we concluded that this was busted. Our actual conclusion was no monkeys do, and I really don't remember the logic to this one, but some things are best left in the past. Now, with any rule, there is an exception to the rule. I call this the Stafford exception. I don't know, most of you probably do know Elaine Stafford. She is very kind, but she is also formidable. I do not want to fall on her bad side. So she wrote this to us. I want to read it verbatim. The drama of the potential is certainly overblown, but there, without any doubt whatsoever, have been circumstances where sharks have caused shunt faults. I wanted to put this in here. Elaine, you're being acknowledged. Okay, let's talk about the new sharks, which is sabotage. And again, I want to first look at news articles. You've probably your relatives have sent you this, right? Like, hey, I know what you do now, right? Okay. It started out, a lot of the attention has been in the Pacific around Taiwan, especially the Baltic. And it started out fairly reasonably with some of the early news articles. Undersea cables cut in Baltic Sea. U.S. allies warn of hybrid warfare. Fair. Okay. Then it came to this. Another undersea cable attacked in the Baltic Sea. Do you see the slight difference in language? It's now attributing intentionality. Anytime there's a cable fault, we started seeing the word attacked. I don't know if any of you know the Daily Express, but they're always really good for headlines. This one says, incredible map shows every underground cable in the world as fears mount over sabotage. That's our map, Alan.
I know.
Did you know these are underground? Yeah. And then some other news outlets decided to just explore this whole topic further and talk about the specific weapons of choice. China unveils game-changing weapon that could change future wars. Turns out they're talking about a grapnel. And, of course, the Daily Express decided they could take that headline and improve upon it. China's terrifying new device, 13,000 feet under the sea, that could plunge the world into darkness. Now, there were some sort of quieter articles that maybe wanted to pump the brakes a little bit on the presumption that all of these faults were attacks. Accidents, according to the Washington Post, not Russian sabotage behind undersea cable damage, officials say. U.S. and European security officials that talked confidentially to this reporter. But it doesn't really feel like this hit home because you continue to see news articles with the previous narrative. This is just from last week. As China targets Taiwan's undersea cables, some locals fear gray zone warfare. So there's just almost a presumption now that this is happening. So again, I wanted to quantify this. What's in our media diet? A couple of days ago, I ran a series of Google News searches with submarine cables and something else with it. Here's submarine cable phishing. There were about 76 hits, unique news articles from the recent times. Submarine cable anchor, even more, that's good. Submarine cable shark, we're making progress here. It's less than phishing, so that's good. Submarine cable hybrid war. How many of you had heard of hybrid war outside of sort of geeky international relations magazines like Foreign Policy until just a few years ago? Now you always see it with submarine cables, it seems. Submarine cable sabotage. Look how many articles there have been compared to what we know is the traditional cause of faults in submarine cable attack. Now again, this is anecdotal. How can we apply data to try to understand this problem? Well, really, there's no answer to this. You have to understand the intentionality or the intentions of the people who are severing or causing these faults. That's very difficult to know. But what we can do, infer, is look back in time. This is from the wonderful work that Andy Palmer-Felgate does, produces every year for the ICPC plenary. You may have seen this one too. These are global repairs over time. And there's some noise every year going up and down, but really, if you look at the trend over time, it's barely going up. He showed another slide yesterday from 2013. If you do that, the number of repairs over time has been going down. And this is especially remarkable. Take a look at this. This is the number of cable kilometers in the world since that's been happening. 50% growth in that time. So in terms of repair per kilometer, it's going way down. So what does this mean for our myth? Well, I see three possibilities. State actors are sabotaging cables, but they're in the long game. Secondly, state actors have recently got into the business of sabotage, but they're exceptionally bad at it. Or third, accidents, like always, remain the primary source of faults. Now, you could say that was just a global view, and it could hide some things. Maybe repairs have gone down in some areas, but repairs in areas where China or Russia are involved have gone way up. Well, Ocean IQ, the Division of Global Marine, presented this paper a couple of years ago at Bangkok. I thought it was so interesting. They take repairs in history. This is from 1985 to 2023, assign quadrants to it, and a heat map it. What we're looking at here, that's the PRC up there. There's Taiwan next to it and Philippines down. Look at all the red historically around Taiwan, where so much of the media attention has been. Now, I want to be a little careful here. I'm testing whether it's likely that intentional state actors have caused a a majority of the faults. It's completely plausible that they have plans or have caused individual faults at some point. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that state actors, China and Russia, have committed cyber attacks in the United States and in Western Europe. And also, we know of a kinetic attack that did happen in the gas pipeline Nord Stream a couple of years ago. So it's completely plausible that kinetic attacks on fiber optic infrastructure could happen. Now, I think and I'm wrapping up here, but the biggest danger, there is a danger here, I think, that if the media attention continues to focus on state actors causing faults, it draws attention away from a real problem that we've had for 100 years in the industry, which is understanding about fishing and anchoring accidental damage. But you could argue that even some of this media attention and government attention may be assisting and benefiting our industry. Retroactively, here's an example. Sweden seizes ship after suspected Baltic cable sabotage. If mariners start being a little more careful about their anchoring practices, because they don't want to get pulled into port, arrested, or sued, maybe that's a good thing. And here's an example of proactive management that would be so hard to imagine just a few years ago. Poland scrambled jets to chase away a ship that was loitering near an undersea power cable in the Baltic. You know, a lot of governments 5 years ago didn't even know what cables were, so maybe this is a good thing. But for our myth, acts of sabotage are a major source of cable faults. I can't say for sure that they are not, but it is exceptionally unlikely. I think we can call this one busted for now. So just to wrap up, our myths. Satellites will end the dominance of submarine cables, busted. Energy is more important than population for a really large data center placement, confirmed. Alan said, demand for submarine cable capacity is not doubling anymore. Content providers account for the majority of investment in new cables, confirmed. The global network has never been more resilient. You said that's plausible, okay. Submarine cable market is cyclical. As you defined it, that's busted. And finally, geopolitical conflict between China and the US has caused those two countries' networks to disconnect, busted. Sharks and acts of sabotage are a major source of cable faults. I think we can safely say that one is busted as well. So that concludes our myths. If you want the slides, feel free. And thank you so much for inviting us back. And thank you.
Great job.
Thanks.